She was just a struggling baker trying to save her dream. He was the ruthless billionaire ready to take it all away. When Sarah Miller finds herself on the brink of losing Sweet Surrender, the only home she and her daughter have ever known, the last person she expects to cross paths with is Alexander Sterling, a man who has everything yet feels nothing. What starts as a battle of survival soon turns into something neither of them saw coming. A connection too deep to ignore, and a love too risky to hold on to. But when powerful enemies strike and secrets come to light, Sarah and Alexander must ask themselves, are they willing to fight for a future together? Or is their love doomed from the start? Betrayal, passion, redemption. If you love forbidden romance, heart-wrenching drama, and an unforgettable love story, don't miss this one. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The golden light of the California sunset filtered through the large windows of Sweet Surrender, casting a warm glow over the small, quiet bakery. The air was thick with the rich aroma of vanilla and cinnamon, yet the usual comforting scent did little to ease the tightness in Sarah Miller's chest. She moved briskly behind the counter, arranging the last batch of cupcakes on a tiered display stand. Her hands, dusted with flour and sugar, worked with precision, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating, worrying, struggling to find a way to keep her business afloat. The past few months had been slow, too slow. The steady stream of customers that once filled the cozy space had dwindled to a trickle, leaving the bakery eerily empty most afternoons. Bills stacked higher than the trays of pastries in the kitchen, and rent was due in just a few days. No matter how many extra hours she put in, how many new recipes she tried, or how many special discounts she offered, it never seemed to be enough. Sarah exhaled softly, running a hand over her forehead. She couldn't let this place go, not just because it was her dream, but because it was home. It was where she had built a life for her daughter, where every corner held a memory. She had poured her heart into these walls, into the worn wooden tables, into every carefully crafted dessert that came out of her oven. The thought of losing it made her stomach twist. A small voice broke through the silence. "Mommy, look! I made something for you!" Sarah turned to see Lily standing in the doorway of the kitchen, holding up a crayon drawing with both hands. Her brown curls bounced as she skipped across the room, her big eyes full of excitement. There was a smudge of flour on her rosy cheek, and her apron, 3 sizes too big, was tied tightly around her waist. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and knelt down. "Oh, wow, sweetheart. Let me see." Lily grinned and thrust the paper into her hands. It was a colorful, slightly lopsided drawing of the bakery. Stick figure versions of Sarah and Lily stood behind the counter, smiling, with what looked like a tray of cupcakes between them. A small round figure next to them had 2 ears and was labeled in big, uneven letters, Mr. Teddy. "And look," Lily pointed proudly, "I put sprinkles on the cupcakes, just like the ones we made last time." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of warmth and sorrow. "This is beautiful, Lily. You even got all the little details right." Lily nodded eagerly. "Can we put it on the wall, right next to the menu so everyone can see it?" Sarah hesitated. She wanted to say yes, wanted to tell Lily that their bakery would still be here next month, that everything would be fine. But the truth weighed heavy in her chest. What if there were no customers left to see it? What if by the end of the month, there was no bakery left at all? She pushed the thought away and forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll put it up right now." Lily clapped her hands together, delighted. As Sarah reached for a piece of tape and carefully pressed the drawing onto the wall beside the chalkboard menu, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe somehow things would turn around. "Mommy," Lily tugged at the hem of her apron. "Yes, love. Can we make a new cupcake today? A special one? Just for us?" Sarah ruffled her daughter's curls, her tiredness momentarily forgotten. "That's a great idea. What kind of cupcake should we make?" Lily's face lit up. "With chocolate, and marshmallows, and lots of sprinkles." Sarah let out a soft laugh, nodding. "As many as you want." For now, this was enough. The bills, the rent, the uncertain future, those could wait a little longer. Right now, it was just her and Lily, standing together in their little bakery, holding onto the dream for one more day. The bell above the bakery door chimed, breaking the quiet hum of the late afternoon. Sarah, busy wiping down the counter, barely glanced up at first. The slow days had made her accustomed to expecting little, perhaps a delivery, maybe a lost tourist wandering in. But when she finally looked toward the entrance, she felt a strange, unshakable sense of unease. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped inside, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the small space. His crisp charcoal suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the cozy warmth of Sweet Surrender. In one hand, he carried a sleek leather folder, the edges of official-looking documents peeking out. The slight furrow of his brow and the impassive set of his mouth made it clear. This was not a casual visit. Sarah instinctively wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, standing a little straighter. "Miss Miller?" The man's voice was deep, smooth, yet utterly devoid of warmth. She hesitated, already knowing who he was. She had heard his name before, Alexander Sterling, the man who owned the building. She had hoped to never have to deal with him directly, but here he was, standing in her bakery like a shadow cast over her fragile world. "That's me," she said, keeping her voice steady. "How can I help you?" Alexander took a measured step forward, flipping open the folder. "I won't take much of your time. I'm here regarding your lease." Sarah's pulse quickened. She forced herself to remain composed, though her fingers clenched slightly against the counter's edge. "What about it?" He didn't soften his delivery. "As you're aware, the terms of your lease allow for termination under certain conditions. Given the financial state of this establishment and your consistent delays in rent payments, we've made the decision to end your lease agreement at the end of the month." For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around her. She had known things were bad, had known that falling behind on payments was dangerous. But hearing it stated so plainly, so clinically, made it feel like a final blow. Sarah swallowed, pushing down the rising panic in her throat. "You're evicting me." Alexander didn't flinch. "The space isn't profitable as it stands. A new tenant has already expressed interest. And as a property owner, I have to make decisions that are best for the business." Business. That word cut deeper than it should have. Sarah inhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet his gaze. There was no room for desperation. Not in front of him. Not in front of anyone. "I understand that you have a business to run, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even but firm. "But this bakery is my business. More than that, it's my home. I just need more time." Alexander studied her, his sharp blue eyes betraying nothing. "Time isn't what keeps businesses afloat, Miss Miller. Money does." Her stomach twisted at the cold finality in his tone, but she held her ground. "Give me a little longer. I know things have been slow, but I have a plan to turn things around." For the first time since he walked in, something flickered across Alexander's expression. It was brief, almost imperceptible. Hesitation? Amusement? He didn't say. Instead, he let out a slow breath and closed the folder, tucking it neatly under his arm. "I'll review your request," he said, "but don't expect miracles." Sarah squared her shoulders. "I don't need miracles. Just a chance." Alexander lingered for a second longer than necessary, his gaze shifting subtly, taking in the rows of carefully arranged pastries, the handwritten chalkboard menu, the scent of something warm and sweet still lingering in the air. Then with a curt nod, he turned and strode toward the door, leaving behind nothing but the scent of expensive cologne and the weight of his words. As the bell chimed again and the door shut behind him, Sarah let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening into fists. A storm had just walked into her bakery, and she wasn't sure if she had just lost everything or if this was just the beginning. Just as the tension in the room thickened, a burst of energy disrupted the heavy silence. A small figure came bounding in from the kitchen, her curls bouncing wildly, her tiny hands dusted in flour. "Lily! Mommy!" she squealed, running straight into Sarah's arms. The force of her excitement made Sarah take a half step back, but she welcomed the warmth of her daughter's embrace. "Look, I made a cookie all by myself." Her big round eyes sparkled as she lifted her little hand, proudly displaying a misshapen cookie. It was slightly overfloured, a little lopsided, but unmistakably made with love. Sarah let out a small chuckle, crouching down to examine her masterpiece. Wow, sweetheart, that looks amazing. I bet it's the best cookie in the world. Lily grinned, turning her attention to the tall man standing just a few feet away. She blinked up at him, taking in the way he stood, rigid, composed, his suit so crisp it looked out of place in their warm, flour-dusted bakery. Who are you? She asked, tilting her head curiously. Alexander Sterling wasn't used to being caught off guard, but for a brief moment he faltered. His gaze dropped from Sarah to the little girl clinging to her apron. He had walked into this shop prepared for a struggling business owner pleading for an extension, for a conversation centered around finances and contracts. What he hadn't expected was this: a small child, barely 5 years old, staring up at him with unabashed curiosity, her chubby fingers still coated in dough. He hadn't expected her. Sarah shifted slightly, resting a protective hand on Lily's back, as if silently reminding him that this wasn't just a business transaction. This was her life, their home. For the first time since stepping into the bakery, Alexander hesitated. His icy demeanor flickered, only for a second, a slight tension in his jaw, a flicker of something unreadable in his sharp blue eyes. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. His expression smoothed over, retreating into its usual unreadable coolness. I'm Alexander Sterling, he answered, his voice even. I own this building. Lily scrunched her nose. So you're the landlord? Sarah bit back a smile. Yes, honey. Something like that. Lily nodded solemnly, as if weighing this new information. Then, without hesitation, she beamed up at him. Do you like cookies? She asked. Because I made a really good one. Sarah held her breath, watching the way Alexander stood there, still, controlled, as if unsure how to respond. He had likely been in countless high-stakes meetings, had probably faced some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the city, yet here he was, completely thrown off by a flour-covered 5-year-old offering him a cookie. For the first time that afternoon, Alexander Sterling was at a loss for words. A few days had passed, and with each sunrise, Sarah braced herself for the inevitable. The lease was still ending, the bills were still stacking up, and her chances of saving sweet surrender felt slimmer by the day. She had begun preparing herself for the worst, until the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see him. Alexander Sterling. Sarah stilled, her hands momentarily pausing in the bowl of flour she was mixing. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. She wasn't sure she wanted to see him at all. What are you doing here? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron, trying to keep her tone neutral. Alexander adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, his expression unreadable. Checking on my property. Sarah gave him a dry look. Your property is still here, and still open. Anything else? She was trying to be polite, but there was no hiding the edge in her voice. The last time he had walked in, he had delivered a sentence, an eviction, wrapped up in legal jargon and business logic. And now he was back. Alexander's gaze flickered toward the counter, where a tray of freshly baked scones rested. The air smelled of cinnamon and melted butter. There was something about the place, something warm, lived in. His eyes moved next to Sarah, who had already turned away from him, her focus shifting back to the dough in front of her. A light sheen of sweat covered her brow from the heat of the oven. Her sleeves were rolled up, and traces of flour dusted her fingers. Her movements were practiced, efficient, yet somehow still graceful. There was something about her, something steady, that he hadn't fully noticed before. Then, before he could process anything further, a familiar voice broke through the moment. Chew, Alex. Lily. She barreled out of the kitchen, a wide grin stretching across her face. Sarah, clearly caught off guard, turned just in time to see her daughter launching herself toward the very man trying to take their home away. Lily, she started, but it was too late. Lily stopped right in front of Alexander, eyes bright with excitement. You came back, she announced, as if that fact alone was proof of some great victory. Alexander blinked. He had not accounted for this. Sarah tensed, fully expecting him to step away, to remind Lily that this was nothing more than a business transaction, that he was not someone to be trusted. But instead, he crouched down. "Lily," he said smoothly, as if they were old acquaintances. "I see you're still causing trouble." Lily giggled. "I'm not causing trouble. Mommy says I'm her best little helper." "She does she?" Lily nodded enthusiastically, then grabbed his hand before he could react. "Come see what I made today. I helped Mommy with the frosting." Sarah stiffened. "Lily, honey, Mr. Sterling is—" But Alexander had already let himself be pulled a few steps forward, right into the heart of the bakery. For a man who had once stood like an outsider in this place, looking at it like nothing more than a failing investment, he suddenly looked different. He watched as Lily pointed proudly at a cupcake, topped with uneven swirls of icing and an unholy amount of sprinkles. "This one is mine," Lily declared. "Do you want to try it?" Alexander exhaled, half amused, half caught off guard. He didn't eat sweets. He didn't indulge in sentimentality. And yet standing here, in this too warm, too happy, too alive bakery, he felt something shift. Not much, just a little, but it was enough to make him stay. Sarah had always been good at reading people. It came with running a small business, learning to recognize the difference between customers who were genuinely interested and those who were just passing the time, between polite smiles and condescending glances. But Alexander Sterling? She couldn't quite figure him out. Ever since he had stepped back into sweet surrender, he had been different. Not the same cold, detached businessman who had handed her an eviction notice without a second thought. Now he lingered. He watched. He even, on more than one occasion, helped. The first time it had caught her completely off guard. She had been reaching for a heavy sack of flour on the top shelf when he stepped in, effortlessly lifting it down and placing it on the counter before she could protest. "You should be careful," he had said, his tone neutral, like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to be in her bakery, offering assistance. Sarah had blinked, staring at him for a long moment before muttering, "I can handle it." The second time it was the flickering kitchen light. One moment she had been standing on a chair, trying to fix it herself. The next, Alexander was there, his hands steadying her waist before she lost balance, his voice low but firm. "Let me." She had climbed down, watching warily as he actually fixed it, rolling up the sleeves of his perfectly tailored shirt, as if manual labor was something he did every day. And then there was Lily. Lily, who had taken an instant liking to him, who greeted him each time he walked in with the same bright enthusiasm, who dragged him into conversations he probably had no intention of having. "Chew, Alex, did you know Mommy makes the best cookies in the world?" "Is that so?" "Uh-huh. But she always forgets to take breaks. You should tell her." Sarah had shot her daughter a warning glance, but Alexander had merely raised an eyebrow, arms crossed over his chest. "She seems stubborn," he had said. "I doubt she listens." Sarah didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't pity, at least it didn't feel like it. Alexander didn't act as though he was doing charity work. He wasn't condescending. He wasn't even particularly kind. If anything, he seemed genuinely interested, which was what unsettled her the most. She had spent years protecting herself, protecting Lily, from anything that felt temporary. She knew better than to rely on people who could walk away. And Alexander Sterling? He was the definition of temporary. She could handle losing sweet surrender if it came to that. She couldn't handle Lily getting attached to someone who wouldn't stay. So the next time Alexander casually rolled up his sleeves and reached for the sink to help her wash a few dishes, Sarah stepped back. "I've got it," she said, her voice measured. "You don't have to do that." Alexander paused, glancing at her. "I know," she swallowed. "Then why are you?" A beat of silence stretched between them. Then finally he said, "I don't know yet." And that was exactly what terrified her. The air inside Sterling Enterprises' boardroom was suffocating. Not because of the dim lighting or the heavy mahogany table that took up the center of the room, but because of the presence of the man sitting at its head, Charles Sterling, his father. The man whose expectations had shaped Alexander's life since the day he was born. Alexander sat across from him, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. But inside, he could feel the pressure tightening around his chest like a vice. "This is not up for debate," Charles said, his voice steady, authoritative, final. "Victoria Huntington is the only logical choice. The Huntington merger will ensure our company survives. Without it, Sterling Enterprises will fall behind. You will marry her." Alexander exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to rub at the tension building at his temples. "You're asking me to sign away my life for a business transaction. I am asking you to do what is necessary." Charles leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You are my son, and as my son, you have responsibilities, ones that go beyond your personal feelings." Alexander's jaw tightened. Personal feelings. The very concept was laughable in his father's world. Feelings were irrelevant. Attachments were distractions. Everything had to be calculated, controlled, cold. "Victoria is willing," Charles continued. "Her family understands the importance of this arrangement. And frankly, Alexander, I expected more from you. You've never been a fool when it comes to business. So why are you hesitating?" Alexander didn't answer, because the truth wasn't something his father would ever understand. He had spent his entire life fulfilling expectations, doing what was necessary, what was expected, what was profitable. And for years it had been easy. He had played the role of the perfect heir, the future CEO, the son molded to carry on the Sterling legacy. And yet, ever since he had stepped into that small bakery, something inside him had started to shift. Sweet Surrender had been nothing more than a failing business on paper. But inside it was warm, lived in. It smelled of sugar and cinnamon, of hard work and passion. It was nothing like the world he had been raised in, a world where profit mattered more than people. And then there was Sarah, stubborn, independent, fiercely protective of her daughter. A woman who had stood in front of him, head held high, refusing to beg even when he had handed her an eviction notice. She had every reason to hate him, to resent him, and yet she hadn't. Instead, she had challenged him. She had made him question the things he had always accepted as truth. And Lily, God, Lily, she had taken one look at him and decided he was worth knowing. No expectations, no obligations, just simple, childlike trust. Alexander hadn't realized how much that meant until now. "A marriage based on business," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Is that the kind of life you want for me?" Charles frowned as if the question itself was foolish. "Love is a liability, Alexander. A weakness. What I want is for you to do your duty." Alexander let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course. Of course that's what he would say. "I'm not going to marry Victoria," he said, standing. "I'm done letting you dictate my life." Charles's expression hardened. "If you walk away from this, you walk away from everything." There it was, the ultimatum. Alexander looked at his father, the man who had shaped him, raised him, controlled him, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to let go. "Then so be it," he said, turning his back on the legacy that had defined him for so long. That night, as he stood in his penthouse staring out at the glittering skyline of the city he had once thought he owned, Alexander realized something. He had spent his entire life chasing power, and yet, in a little bakery that smelled like sugar and dreams, he had finally started to feel alive. Alexander kept coming back. At first, Sarah told herself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he just happened to be in the area. But coincidences didn't happen this often, and soon, even she had to admit, he was showing up on purpose. He never made a big deal out of it, never gave her an explanation. He would just walk in, his presence filling the small bakery as if he had always belonged there, and then, without a word, he would start helping. A broken chair leg? He fixed it. A stack of heavy flour bags? He carried them. The flickering light bulb she had been meaning to replace for weeks? He had it switched out before she even asked. Sarah wasn't sure what to make of it. He didn't offer to help, he just did, and that was what unsettled her the most. She was used to people making promises they didn't keep, used to men who swooped in with grand gestures only to disappear when things got hard. But Alexander never promised her anything. He just showed up. He was consistent. And for someone like Sarah, who had spent most of her life doing everything alone, that was terrifying. She could feel herself softening toward him, despite every instinct telling her not to. It wasn't just the things he did. It was the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The way he listened when she spoke. How he remembered the smallest details she mentioned in passing. The way he made Lily laugh. That, more than anything, scared her. She had spent years protecting herself, but Lily was a different story. Lily, who was too young to understand what it meant to have someone walk away, who already adored Alexander, greeted him like he was a part of their world, as if she had decided that he belonged in their little family. Sarah couldn't afford to let herself believe that too, so she kept her distance. She was polite but careful, warm but distant. Whenever he got too close, whenever he lingered for too long, she would pull back just enough, not enough to push him away completely, but enough to remind herself that this was temporary, that Alexander Sterling was not the kind of man who stayed, and yet every time she turned away, she could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting, as if he was just as unsure as she was about what this was becoming. The morning rush had just begun, and Sarah was lost in the familiar rhythm of arranging fresh pastries inside the glass display case. The scent of warm cinnamon and butter filled the small space, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal, calm, routine, safe. Then the doorbell chimed. Sarah barely glanced up at first, expecting to see a regular customer, but when she finally did, her hands froze. A woman stood in the doorway, poised with effortless confidence, as if she had stepped out of the pages of a high-fashion magazine and into the wrong world. She was stunning, tall, elegant, with striking features that were just a little too perfect. Everything about her, from the designer handbag draped over her wrist to the sharp, assessing gleam in her icy blue eyes, screamed wealth and privilege. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. Slowly, the woman took a step inside, her heels clicking against the wooden floor as she scanned the bakery with an expression of mild distaste, as if the very air offended her. Sarah didn't have to ask who she was. She already knew. This could only be Victoria Huntington. Sarah straightened, brushing the flour from her hands. "Can I help you?" Victoria's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something close enough to pass for one. "I certainly hope so," she said smoothly. "I was looking for Alexander." There was no reason for Sarah's stomach to twist at the sound of his name, but it did. She willed herself to stay composed. "I'm afraid he's not here," she said evenly. Victoria hummed as if she had expected as much. Then, instead of leaving, she took another step forward. Sarah tensed. "So this is it," Victoria mused, looking around. "This is where he's been spending all his time." She turned her gaze back to Sarah, eyes gleaming with something sharp. Amusement? Pity? I have to admit, I imagined something grander. Sarah felt the sting of the words, but she didn't let it show. She simply raised an eyebrow. "It's a bakery, not a five-star hotel." Victoria let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Yes, I can see that." Sarah folded her arms. "If Alexander isn't here, I don't see what business you have with me." Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if considering her. Then, with deliberate slowness, she walked toward the counter, trailing a manicured finger along the wooden surface as though she owned the place. "You know," she said, her voice almost bored, "I didn't come here to fight with you, Miss Miller." Sarah didn't respond. She simply waited. "I just wanted to see for myself," Victoria continued, meeting Sarah's gaze, "to understand what exactly could make Alexander so distracted, so reckless." Sarah clenched her jaw. "Excuse me?" Victoria sighed, almost sympathetically. "Did you really think this was something real?" She gestured vaguely around the shop. "That he was ever going to stay here? With you?" Something sharp pierced through Sarah's chest, but she refused to let Victoria see it. Victoria leaned in slightly, voice soft, almost gentle. "I know Alexander. I know how he works. He's drawn to challenges, to things that feel different from what he knows. And maybe for now that's you, but eventually." She gave a small shrug. He'll get bored, he'll move on, and he'll go back to where he belongs. Sarah felt the impact of every word like a blow she should have seen coming. Not because she believed Victoria, but because she had thought the same thing herself. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The air was thick with unspoken tension, an invisible battle of wills playing out between them. Then Sarah took a slow breath, steadying herself, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, unwavering. "What happens between me and Alexander is none of your concern," she said simply. "Now, if you're not going to order anything, I'd appreciate it if you left." Victoria's eyes flashed as if she hadn't expected resistance, but then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Fair enough," she murmured, and just like that, she turned on her heel and strode toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor once more. As the bell above the door jingled behind her, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled slightly. She didn't know if Victoria had come to warn her or simply to plant a seed of doubt. But either way, she had succeeded. The moment Alexander stepped into Sterling Enterprises, the tension in the air was suffocating. He moved through the sleek, glass-paneled hallways with purpose, his jaw clenched, his temper barely contained beneath the surface. He had heard everything. Victoria had gone to sweet surrender. She had cornered Sarah, insulted her, and tried to rip apart something that wasn't hers to destroy. That was his mistake, thinking that Victoria would simply accept his decision, that she would let go of an arrangement that was never meant to be. He reached the executive floor, pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the private lounge, and found her, Victoria Huntington, sitting comfortably in one of the leather chairs, sipping an espresso, as if she hadn't just tried to dismantle the one thing in his life that actually made sense. She looked up, surprised but not shaken. "Alexander," she greeted smoothly, setting her cup down. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He shut the door behind him with a little too much force. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Victoria barely blinked at his tone. If anything, she looked amused. "I assume you're referring to my visit to that charming little bakery of yours?" Alexander took a step forward, voice low but razor sharp. "Stay away from Sarah," Victoria exhaled, shaking her head in mock sympathy. "Oh, Alexander, you always were so dramatic." She crossed one leg over the other, her perfectly manicured nails tapping idly against the armrest. "I simply wanted to see what had captured your attention so completely. And now I understand." She smirked. "You're playing house." His eyes darkened. "This isn't a game." "No?" She tilted her head. "Then tell me, how long do you think this will last? A month? 2? You think you can trade in your world for hers? Give up everything for a woman who bakes cupcakes in a shop that won't even be standing in a year?" Alexander's hands curled into fists. "I told you, I'm not marrying you." Victoria let out a soft laugh, as if the idea was absurd. "Oh, darling, that's not your decision to make." He stiffened. She leaned forward, voice lowering to something far more dangerous. "You think your father will allow you to walk away? You are the heir to Sterling Enterprises. Your life isn't just yours, Alexander. It never was." The words hit hard because they weren't entirely false. His father had been controlling his future since the day he was born. Every move he made, every deal, every connection, it had all been mapped out for him, and for years he had followed the plan without question. Until now. Until her. Alexander exhaled slowly, unclenching his fists. Then when he spoke again, his voice was calm, firm, final. "I don't give a damn what my father wants," he said. "I don't care about the business, the merger, or whatever power move you think you're making. I'm not going to marry you, Victoria. Not now. Not ever." Victoria's smirk faltered. For the first time since he walked in, he saw something flicker in her expression. Shock, frustration, maybe even desperation. She had never expected him to say no. She had never thought he would choose something else, someone else, over his family's empire. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're making a mistake." Alexander shook his head. "No, I'm finally making my own decisions." He turned on his heel, pushing the door open without another word. But just before he stepped out, Victoria spoke again, her voice colder than before. Your father will never accept this. Alexander paused, but he didn't look back. Then that's his problem, he said before walking away. As the door shut behind him, Victoria sat in stunned silence, staring at the empty space where he had stood. Her plan, her perfect, calculated plan, had just crumbled before her eyes, and for the first time in her life, Victoria Huntington had lost. The fall came swiftly. Only days after he had walked out on Victoria, Alexander was summoned back to Sterling Enterprises. But this time, it wasn't for a negotiation. It was a reckoning. When he entered the conference room, he already knew what was coming. The long, polished table was filled with familiar faces. Board members, senior executives, shareholders, men and women who had stood beside his father for decades. At the head of it all, Charles Sterling, composed as ever, his expression a mask of disappointment and quiet fury. Alexander didn't bother sitting. His father spoke first. You left me no choice. A thick silence filled the room as a legal document was slid across the table toward him. Alexander picked it up, scanning the contents. Effective immediately, Alexander Sterling is to be relieved of all executive duties at Sterling Enterprises. His decision-making authority is to be revoked pending further review by the board of directors. Until further notice, he is officially suspended from his role within the company. He exhaled slowly, placing the document back down. One of the board members cleared his throat. Alexander, this isn't personal. The company is at risk. Your refusal to go through with the Huntington merger has damaged investor confidence. Your actions have put us in a vulnerable position. Enough. His voice was calm, but final. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward his father. So this is how you deal with disappointment? He mused. Strip me of everything? Cut me out of my own company? His father folded his hands together. You cut yourself out the moment you decided to act recklessly. Alexander let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Recklessly? His jaw clenched. For once in my life, I did something for myself. Not for this company, not for the numbers in some quarterly report. And because of that, you're willing to throw me away? Charles met his gaze without flinching. You were never irreplaceable. The words struck harder than Alexander expected, not because they were shocking, but because he finally believed them. All these years he had told himself that if he worked hard enough, if he became the son his father expected him to be, then one day he would matter. That one day Charles Sterling would see him as something more than a strategic asset. But now he knew better. Alexander took one last glance around the table. He had spent years in this room, making decisions, signing contracts, leading negotiations, and yet standing here now, staring at these people who once pretended to respect him, all he felt was emptiness. For the first time in his life, Sterling Enterprises was no longer his future, and that realization didn't terrify him. With a slow breath, he straightened his suit jacket. Fine. One word. Simple. Final. His father watched him carefully. You're walking away. I'm not walking away, Alexander corrected. You're the one who let me go. Without another glance, he turned and strode out of the room, ignoring the hushed murmurs behind him. As he stepped outside, the cold reality hit him. He had just lost everything. His career, his power, his family's backing. And yet, deep inside, beneath the uncertainty and the chaos, there was something else. Something quiet. Something almost like relief. Because for the first time, he wasn't following the life that had been designed for him. He was about to build one of his own. Sarah stood behind the counter of sweet surrender, staring blankly at the tray of pastries in front of her. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla and warm sugar, but today the comforting aroma did nothing to settle the storm raging inside her. She had just heard the news. Alexander Sterling had lost everything. She could hardly believe it. The Alexander she knew, the sharp, controlled businessman, was no longer part of the empire he was supposed to inherit. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like an invisible force, suffocating and relentless. And the worst part? She couldn't shake the feeling that it was her fault. Since the day he walked into her bakery, their worlds had started colliding. Two lives that were never meant to intertwine. And now, because of her, because of this thing between them, he had lost his company, his position, his family's backing. Sarah tightened her grip on the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. What if he regretted it? What if now that everything had crumbled, he would look at her differently, see her not as someone worth fighting for, but as the reason he had lost his place in the world? She had spent so many nights lying awake, replaying every conversation, every moment between them, trying to make sense of it all, trying to justify why a man like Alexander Sterling would choose to stay in her tiny, failing bakery when he had once commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. But no matter how she looked at it, the truth remained the same. They came from two different worlds. And no matter how much she wished otherwise, he would eventually go back to where he belonged. The thought made her chest ache, because for the first time in years, she had let herself hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Hope that someone saw her, truly saw her, and chose her anyway. But hope was dangerous. Hope made people reckless. Hope made her want things she could never have. She couldn't afford to make that mistake. Not for herself. Not for Lily. With a heavy heart, she made her decision. She would end it before it destroyed them both. Before she became the reason he resented his choices. Before she let herself fall any deeper into something that was never meant to last. The next time Alexander walked through her door, she would let him go. Alexander sat in his now empty office, the view of the city skyline stretching before him, the space that once felt like his domain, a place where he made decisions that moved markets, where his voice held weight, was no longer his. The desk had been cleared, the shelves emptied. His father's parting words echoed in his mind. You were never irreplaceable. And yet Alexander felt strangely calm. Losing Sterling Enterprises should have broken him. It should have left him furious, lost, desperate. But it didn't, because for the first time in his life, he was free. He had spent years playing by the rules of a world that had never truly been his. Years making deals for numbers on a screen, growing an empire that had never really belonged to him. And yet in the past few weeks, standing inside a tiny bakery filled with warmth, laughter, and the scent of sugar and vanilla, he had felt something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. He could sit here and drown in regret, or he could build something new, and he already knew where to start. The bell above Sweet Surrender chimed, and Sarah wasn't ready to see him. She had made up her mind. She was supposed to tell him that they were too different, that this, whatever this was, couldn't last. But when she looked up, when she saw him standing there, something stopped her. It wasn't the same Alexander Sterling who had walked into her bakery weeks ago, cold and untouchable. This man was different. There was no arrogance, no untouchable authority in his stance. His suit jacket was slung over one shoulder, his sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly mussed from the wind. He looked lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from him. But what truly caught her off guard was his expression, determined, steady, hopeful. I want to invest, he said simply. Sarah blinked. What? In Sweet Surrender, Alexander clarified, stepping closer. I want to put my money, my time, my experience into this place. Into you. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Alexander continued, voice firm but genuine. I've spent my entire life building things that didn't mean anything to me. But this place, this dream of yours, it means something. And I want to be part of it. She shook her head slightly, still trying to process. Alexander, you don't have to. I'm not doing this because I have to, he interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. I'm doing it because I want to. Sarah's heart pounded. She had been prepared for heartbreak, for him to walk away. Not for this. Not for him to choose to stay. Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out a neatly folded document. This is a full proposal, he explained. We can expand, update equipment, get better suppliers. You have the talent. I have the business experience. Together we can turn Sweet Surrender into something bigger. Sarah hesitated. She should say no. She should remind him that he had just lost an empire, that he belonged to a world of power and wealth, not in a small bakery covered in flour and sugar. But when she met his gaze, she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. Conviction, not pity, not obligation. A man who had lost everything and still chose to be here. She swallowed hard, her fingers brushing over the edges of the papers he handed her. "This is insane," she murmured. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. "Then let's be insane together." The plan was coming together. For the first time in a long time, Sweet Surrender wasn't just surviving, it was growing. With Alexander's business expertise and Sarah's talent, they had begun making real changes. A fresh marketing strategy, better ingredients, updated equipment. It was all finally coming together. Customers were returning, word was spreading, and the once struggling bakery was starting to look like a real success story. But success had a price, and someone didn't want them to win. It started with whispers. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too busy managing the new influx of customers, perfecting new recipes, and working alongside Alexander, who had somehow gone from a corporate shark to someone who could casually roll up his sleeves and help her knead dough. But then, one day, a woman hesitated before buying a cupcake. "I heard there was an issue with your ingredients," she said cautiously. Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman shifted awkwardly. I don't know. I just heard that there were complaints, that someone got sick." Sarah's stomach dropped. That wasn't true. She was meticulous about quality. Every single item that left her kitchen was made with care, precision, and the best ingredients she could afford. By the time she turned to Alexander, her hands were shaking. "We have a problem," she murmured. He didn't even hesitate. "We'll fix it." But it didn't stop there. A few days later, an anonymous review surfaced online. "I used to love this place, but ever since the new owner got involved, the quality has gone downhill. Be careful. Something's not right." Then another. "Sweet Surrender used to be amazing, but I heard their supplier got shut down for using expired goods. Won't be coming back." Sarah's hands clenched around her phone. "This is deliberate," Alexander muttered, his voice dangerously calm as he read through the fabricated reviews. "Someone is trying to ruin us." Sarah's heart pounded. "But who?" He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "I have an idea." The answer came 2 nights later. It was early morning when Sarah arrived at the bakery, keys in hand, ready to start the day. The moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, her heart stopped. The front window was shattered. Glass shards littered the pavement. Inside, tables were overturned, chairs knocked to the floor, and baking equipment lay broken across the counter. The cash register was wide open, emptied. Not that they ever kept much inside. This wasn't a robbery. This was a warning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her dream, her home, had been violated. A familiar car pulled up beside the curb, and within seconds, Alexander was by her side. He didn't ask what had happened. He took one look at the destruction and immediately understood. Sarah's voice trembled. They ruined everything." "No!" His voice was steel. "They didn't." She turned to him, her chest tightening. "Alexander, we can't fight this. We're a small bakery going up against someone with real power. Whoever did this, they're not going to stop." For a long moment, Alexander was silent. Then something shifted in his expression, a sharp, ruthless edge that reminded Sarah exactly who he was before he walked into her world. "They want to fight?" he murmured, his voice dangerously low. "Then let's give them one." Sarah had spent years trying to survive, trying to protect what little she had. But she had never fought like this. And with Alexander at her side, she realized, maybe it was time. The attack on Sweet Surrender wasn't the only battle Alexander had to fight. While he and Sarah were trying to salvage what was left of the bakery, his enemies were moving against him in the shadows. Victoria Huntington wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Humiliated by Alexander's rejection and furious at his blatant disregard for the Sterling legacy, she wanted revenge, and she knew exactly where to strike. With the help of one of Charles Sterling's most trusted board members, a man who had long resented Alexander's influence, she orchestrated a scandal. It started subtly, a leaked memo, an anonymous tip. Then within days, the media was running with the headline, "Corruption in the Sterling Empire. Did Alexander Sterling embezzle millions before his exit?" Suddenly, Alexander's name was everywhere. Reports surfaced claiming that before being ousted, he had siphoned company funds into private accounts, covering it up under false business expenses. The accusations were entirely fabricated, but they didn't have to be true to cause damage. They just had to be loud. And Victoria made sure they were. She didn't stop there. Somehow the media also got pictures of him and Sarah, captured through the glass of Sweet Surrender's windows. Moments of them working together. Moments of them looking at each other the way they shouldn't have been looking if they were just business partners. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Did Alexander Sterling risk his family's fortune for a small-town baker? From billionaire to nobody, how one woman brought down a Sterling heir. Sarah saw the articles before Alexander did. She read every vicious word, felt every single cut they made. And worst of all, she believed them. Not the lies about him stealing, no. She knew Alexander better than that. But the part about her? That part wasn't a lie. She had become a distraction. She had been the reason he lost everything. She had told herself before that their worlds were too different. And now, the world was shoving it in her face, proving her right. She had cost him everything. Meanwhile, Charles Sterling was furious. Not because of the scandal, he had weathered plenty in his time, but because, for the first time in his career, he wasn't in control of the narrative. The Sterling name was being dragged through the mud, and his son was the face of it. But something didn't sit right. He had spent his entire life calculating risks, reading people, understanding leverage, and something about this felt off. Victoria was too eager. The timing was too convenient. The accusations against Alexander were too perfect. And so, for the first time, Charles Sterling did something he had never done before. He questioned himself. Had he been wrong? Had he let ambition and power blind him to the truth? Had he misjudged his own son? As he watched the empire he built shake under the weight of scandal, he made a decision. He would find out the truth, once and for all. The storm was supposed to destroy him. That's what they wanted, for Alexander Sterling to fall, to disappear into disgrace, to be nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. But they underestimated him. And now he was about to end this. It started with whispers, just like the scandal itself. Anonymous sources retracting statements, discrepancies in the leaked financial reports. A handful of former colleagues, people who had once respected him, started to talk. Then, one by one, the cracks in Victoria's plan began to show. The offshore accounts? They didn't exist. The missing company funds reallocated legally under a project that was conveniently buried after Alexander was removed. And the anonymous sources accusing him? All linked back to Victoria and her allies. It had taken weeks of digging, of calling in favors from the few people still loyal to him. Late nights sifting through financial records, meetings in dimly lit bars, with former employees who wanted to clear their conscience but were afraid to speak. But now he had everything he needed. The press conference was packed, cameras flashed, reporters whispered among themselves, hungry for blood. Charles Sterling stood at the podium first, his expression as unreadable as ever. For a moment, the world held its breath, waiting for him to bury his son completely. Instead, he did the opposite. In recent weeks, allegations have been made against my son, Alexander Sterling, Charles began, his voice steady, commanding. These allegations were presented as facts, damaging not only our company's reputation, but his personal integrity. A pause and then, the first strike. But today we present the truth. Murmurs erupted in the crowd as Alexander stepped forward. He was supposed to be ruined. Instead, he looked unshaken, confident, in control. And then he spoke. All accusations against me have been fabricated, he stated, and I can prove it. The next few minutes unraveled everything. Documents were displayed. Signed statements from former board members confirming their coercion. records of transactions that had been altered to frame him, a direct trail leading back to Victoria and her allies. One of the reporters in the front row leaned forward. "So what you're saying is you were framed?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "No. What I'm saying is they tried to bury me, but they failed." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to ask questions. Some called out Victoria's name, demanding a response. And Victoria? She was conspicuously absent. By the time the press conference ended, the damage had already been done. Not to Alexander, to her, and to every single person who had tried to tear him down. Hours later, in the quiet of his father's office, Alexander stood across from Charles Sterling. The older man studied him for a long moment, fingers steepled, measuring the son he had underestimated. "You fought back," he finally said. "I did," Alexander replied. Another pause, then something that almost resembled pride flickered in his father's eyes. "You're more like me than I thought," Alexander exhaled slowly. "No, I'm nothing like you." A beat of silence. Then Charles leaned back in his chair, regarding him carefully. "The board wants you back," he said. "Your position, your company, it's yours, if you want it." For years, this was all Alexander had worked for. His birthright, his legacy, and yet, he didn't want it anymore. The empire he had spent his life trying to inherit had nearly destroyed him. And the only thing that had kept him standing wasn't in this office, wasn't in this company. It was in a small bakery, covered in flour, laughing with a little girl who didn't care about his last name, and a woman who made him feel like he belonged somewhere for the first time. So he made his final decision. "I'm not coming back." His father's eyes darkened. "You'd walk away? After everything?" "I'm not walking away." Alexander's voice was firm. "I'm finally choosing for myself." Then without hesitation, he turned and walked out. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. The bakery was quiet that evening. The usual warmth, the comforting scent of vanilla and cinnamon, the gentle hum of the ovens, the soft clatter of utensils, felt distant, almost hollow. Sarah stood behind the counter, mechanically wiping down the surface. But her hands weren't steady. Her heart wasn't steady. She had watched the press conference. She had seen Alexander stand tall, reclaim his name, his honor, his place in the world, and she had felt relieved, but also terrified, because now that he had his life back, where did that leave her? Sarah had spent years convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that love, real, lasting love, was something people like her didn't get to have. And Alexander? He wasn't meant to stay. She had known it from the moment he first stepped into sweet surrender. He belonged to a different world, a world of power and privilege, a world that had nearly destroyed him, but now welcomed him back with open arms. And yet, for a brief moment, she had allowed herself to believe, to hope. And that was the real danger. Hope had a cruel way of making people think they could hold on to something that was never meant for them. So she had made her decision. She would walk away before he did. When the bell above the door chimed, Sarah didn't look up. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was. Alexander. His steps were measured as he crossed the floor, but there was something different in his presence. He wasn't here as a businessman, wasn't here to talk about investments or expansion. He was just here. For her. Sarah. His voice was low, steady. She forced herself to keep moving, to keep packing things away as if her world wasn't about to shatter. "You did it," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "You cleared your name." "I did," he murmured. He was watching her closely. "But I didn't do it for them." She stiffened. "Sarah," he continued, stepping closer. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about," she said quickly. Too quickly. He frowned, his eyes darkening. "That's not true, and you know it." She inhaled sharply, pressing her hands against the counter. "This," she forced herself to say it, even though it made her chest ache. "This was never going to last, Alexander. You have your life back now, your name, your company, your world. And her voice wavered. "I don't belong in it." She couldn't say it aloud, but he heard it anyway. Alexander let out a slow breath. Then instead of arguing, Instead of fighting, he did something that completely undid her. He reached for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, warm, steady, certain. "Sarah," he said softly, "do you really think I went through all of this just to walk away from you?" Her heart twisted painfully. "You don't have to feel guilty," he continued. "You didn't ruin my life. You saved it." Sarah swallowed hard, struggling to believe him. Because if she let herself believe, if she let herself fall completely, what happened when he finally left? Because people always left. She pulled her hand away, and for the first time, Alexander looked hurt. She could see it, the flicker of something raw in his expression. But he didn't get angry. He didn't push. He just waited. Waited for her to trust him. Waited for her to believe that maybe, just maybe this time, someone was going to stay. The morning air was crisp, the first golden rays of sunlight streaming through the bakery windows, casting soft shadows on the empty tables. Sarah sat at the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The bakery was open, the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air, but there was no warmth in her heart today. She had barely slept the night before. Her mind kept replaying the look in Alexander's eyes when she pulled away from him, the way he had waited for her to believe him, and the way she hadn't been able to. The thought made her stomach twist with regret. She didn't hear the soft patter of footsteps behind her, didn't see Lily standing near the back of the room, her tiny hands gripping a phone she wasn't supposed to be using. Alexander was halfway through his morning routine when his phone rang. He frowned when he saw the caller ID. Sarah wouldn't be calling, not after last night. But it wasn't Sarah, it was Lily. Curious and a little concerned, he picked up. "Lily?" The little girl's voice came through the speaker, soft but insistent. "Uncle Alex, Mommy is sad." Alexander's heart clenched. "She won't say it," Lily continued, her voice small but determined. "But I know." There was a pause, then a little more hesitantly. "Can you come have pastries with us?" Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't been sure if he should go back, if he should push. But this wasn't about business. This wasn't about pride. This was about them. And if Lily was brave enough to reach for him, then maybe it was time he did the same. "I'll be there soon," he promised. When the bakery door chimed a little while later, Sarah looked up, expecting a customer. Instead, she saw Alexander. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to come back, but there he was, standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes locked onto hers with quiet determination. Before she could say anything, Lily ran straight to him, grabbing his hand and pulling him forward. "Uncle Alex came to have pastries with us," she announced cheerfully. Sarah's lips parted slightly. "Lily, I—" But before she could protest, Lily dragged Alexander right up to the counter, her small hands wrapping around both of theirs, pressing them together like a child playing matchmaker. "Now we can all sit together," she said brightly, beaming at both of them. Alexander chuckled, but his eyes never left Sarah's. "I suppose we can." Sarah hesitated. She had been so afraid, so convinced that letting him in would only lead to heartbreak. But here he was, still here, still choosing her. And Lily, their Lily, was looking at them both with so much joy, so much innocent certainty, as if she knew something they didn't. Sarah let out a slow breath. Then for the first time in days, she smiled. And just like that, the distance they had built between them vanished. They sat together at one of the small wooden tables, sharing a single warm pastry between the three of them, the quiet morning wrapped in something that felt suspiciously like family. The morning of the surprise, Sweet Surrender felt different. The bakery was still the same, warm, inviting, filled with the comforting scent of vanilla and sugar. But today, it held something more. Anticipation, excitement, love. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too busy kneading dough, too caught up in the routine that had become second nature to her. But when she turned around, she saw it. The display case was empty, not because they had run out of pastries, but because Alexander had replaced them, with cupcakes, dozens of them. Each one carefully decorated, Some slightly lopsided, Lily's work no doubt, but all arranged into a perfect message. Will you marry me? Sarah's breath caught. She turned, heart pounding, just as the bell above the door chimed. And there he was, Alexander. But not the businessman, not the billionaire. Just him, the man who had stood by her, fought for her, loved her and Lily, when he had every reason to walk away. He stepped closer, and before she could say a word, before she could even think, he knelt down. The world seemed to pause. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers, steady, like he always was. Sarah, he said softly, I used to think I had everything, but then I lost it all, and somehow, that's when I found what really mattered. Her throat tightened. I love you, he continued, his voice unwavering. Not just you and Lily. I love the way you fight for what you believe in. I love the way you look at me like I'm more than just my last name. I love the life we've started building together, and I don't want to spend another day pretending like I could ever walk away from it. Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. Then his grip on her hand tightened slightly, and his voice dropped to something even more raw, honest, real. I want to be your husband, Sarah. I want to be Lily's father. I want us to be a family, because we already are. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Lily, who had been standing beside them the whole time, let out an excited gasp. Mommy, say yes. Sarah let out a breathless laugh, her heart so full she thought it might burst. And then, for the first time in years, she let herself believe. She nodded, smiling through the tears. Yes, she whispered. Then louder, stronger. Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you. Lily let out a cheer, clapping her hands, while Alexander stood and pulled Sarah into his arms. And there, in the heart of the bakery, surrounded by flour-dusted countertops and the scent of something sweet and warm, Sarah finally let herself have it. A home, a future, a love that would stay. The wedding was nothing like the extravagant affairs expected of a sterling heir, and yet it was perfect. It was held in the backyard of a charming countryside inn, beneath string lights that swayed gently in the evening breeze. There were no over-the-top decorations, no high-profile guests, just the people who truly mattered. Lily was the most excited of them all, proudly tossing flower petals down the aisle before spinning in circles, making sure everyone saw how important her role was. Sarah walked toward Alexander, her heart steady for the first time in years. There were no doubts left, no fears, because this wasn't a dream anymore. This was real, and when they said their vows, when Alexander looked at her like she was the only thing that had ever made sense, she knew. This was home. The biggest surprise of the evening came later. Just as the celebration was winding down, Charles Sterling arrived. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching the scene unfold. The man who once ruled his life, now looking uncertain for the first time. Alexander spotted him first. They locked eyes, an unspoken conversation passing between them. Then, finally, his father gave a slow nod, a quiet acknowledgement, a small, hesitant blessing. And that was enough. Sweet surrender flourished. With Sarah's recipes and Alexander's business expertise, they turned the small bakery into something extraordinary. They expanded, opened new locations. But no matter how successful they became, the heart of it never changed. It was still warm, still familiar, still the place where it all began. And for Lily, now a little older, life was exactly what it was always meant to be. She had a mother who loved her beyond words. She had a home filled with laughter, the scent of fresh bread, and the comforting warmth of morning hugs. And now she had a father, one who tucked her in at night, one who cheered the loudest when she baked her own cookies, even when they were slightly burnt, one who held her hand when she whispered just before bed, "Good night, Daddy." And every time he heard it, Alexander knew. He had found the only success that had ever truly mattered. A family. The bakery was filled with the scent of warm butter and sugar, the golden afternoon light streaming through the windows, casting a soft glow over the small wooden table in the center of Sweet Surrender. Sarah sat beside Alexander, their fingers brushing as they reached for the same freshly baked pastry. Across from them, Lily giggled, her eyes bright with mischief as she snatched the treat first, taking a triumphant bite. "You cheated," Alexander accused playfully, raising an eyebrow at the little girl. Lily grinned, crumbs clinging to the corners of her mouth. "You're too slow, Daddy." Sarah chuckled, leaning against Alexander as he let out a dramatic sigh of defeat. It was a simple moment, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet it meant everything, because this was what they had fought for. This was what they had almost lost. A family, a home, a love that wasn't built on grand gestures or fleeting romance, but on resilience, sacrifice, and the willingness to choose each other again and again, no matter what came their way. Sweet Surrender had always been more than just a bakery. It was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes true strength isn't about standing alone, but about knowing when to surrender. Not in weakness, but in love. Surrendering pride, surrendering fear, surrendering the walls we build to keep others out, only to realize that love is the one thing worth letting in. Sarah, Alexander, and Lily sat together, sharing a single pastry, their laughter filling the space that had once been a place of solitude but was now a home. And as Alexander reached for Sarah's hand, lacing their fingers together, she finally understood. This was love, not perfect, not effortless, but real and forever.